I work at Birkbeck College. I teach law there, so I don't know why I know this. But I did social science in the past, so I'm going to teach a little bit about social science, not a lot. I'm a native English speaker. This is my mother tongue. So, and...
Pride.
Yeah.
Pride.
I don't know, these gay people, they get everywhere, don't they?
Just for you, we ordered. Just for you.
Thank you.
For the start.
Yeah, I'm a native English speaker. I also have a bad habit when I teach that I speak too quickly. I get nervous and I get faster and faster. So, I need a method where you can tell me to slow down. And so you all have one of these. And in true Barcelona Football Club style, wave this. Actually, they do it in most of Spain. It's when they're upset with the team playing the game. But if you want to wave this, I will try and recognise that as a sign to slow down, or I'll ask you why you're waving it, and then you can tell me to slow down. So do ask me to slow down, and I will try and speak slow. Right, this is roughly what I'm going to cover. I'm first of all going to try and boost your own confidence that you all do social science research, you just don't realise it because we don't call it that. I'm then going to talk a bit about the scientific method or scientific methods and social scientific methods and why they're linked, why they're different, how they link, how they differ. And then a number of issues with social science, and one particular one I'm going to look at is a way of doing social science, which is surveys, because what I'm going to come to at the end is the HAND project, which is about hepatitis access. And although not necessarily for the first part of the HAND project, there is a second part, and that hopefully you will be able and more confident on doing some of the research for the second part. So I'm going to say a bit about the first part. I'm actually going to get you to do a bit of the first part, and then I'll collect the results and send them to Spiller, see if we got the same answers. First of all, I'm going to prove to you you're all social researchers. So, if you're quite old, you might recognise this hotel. I'm hoping you don't. But these were things that happened at this hotel. So, would you stay there?
I would.
You like a rat in your food. You've come in at just the perfect moment, Maxine, to have no idea what's going on.
Well, there's a rat in my food. I don't have a dog.
Right, well, I'm hoping, apart from Tamash, you've looked at that and thought, no, I probably wouldn't stay in a hotel which has a dead guest in the kitchen. And that there's no way to get to the restaurant because they've bricked up the door. And you have done a piece of social science, and you can do this on TripAdvisor. You have looked at a whole collection of information, you've put it together, and you've made a decision. And often in social science there isn't a lot more to it than that. You have brought together different bits of information, and you have decided something. And you've made a good choice. Don't stay at Faulty Towers. You will know all of this. This is the way medical research is generally conducted, and we heard about some wonderful trials that Janssen and Gilead are going to be doing. It's going to change the world. In medical research, generally, the things you look for is whether the results are valid and reliable. Can you repeat them later on? And that's what you can do in a randomized controlled trial. The idea is that you've done it once, you can repeat it, and you will get roughly the same result. You will look for findings that are statistically significant, and you will look for research that is reliable. And I put that up there because in a lot of social science you can't do those things because of the way it works. You can't end up proving things statistically, and validity and reliability, being valid and reliable, is so difficult or impossible. Therefore, it is not the criteria you generally use. And also, even if you use stats and medical research, this is Caroline Sabin's famous line, statistically we have proven men are much better at dying than women. And that goes across all ages. At all ages, men will be dying far more successfully than women. We can be proud of that.
What do you mean?
I mean, the percentage death rate at age 50, 55, 60, 65 is always higher for men than women. One of the things, though, you can do with medical research, you can take a hypothesis and you can demonstrate it. So, I did have on this slide earlier today a drug. Can a drug eradicate hepatitis from the body? But then, of course, it occurred to me we don't have drugs in hepatitis. We have fixed dose combinations because nobody wants to sell their drugs individually. So, a fixed dose combination, and you can use it to eradicate hepatitis from a body. However, the thing we would like would be to eradicate hepatitis from countries, from the world. Medical research is really well designed and geared up to do one. It's not so good at doing two. And if you just go through the ways that you would do this for people and a group of people, you cannot do a placebo-controlled trial on eradicating Hep C from countries. Because obviously you'd have to deny another country access to the drugs. And that is completely unethical. You could look at what we did. We have eliminated one disease from this planet, and that is smallpox. And we did that about 40 years ago. But we don't actually have great records of how we did that, and we did that generally using a mixture of vaccination and treatment. We don't have vaccination in Hep C, so we couldn't use that approach. And I don't think we would, actually, even if we had the opportunity, because we similarly have the opportunity with polio to eradicate it, but it is getting so expensive to eradicate it at the very end that countries are being less interested in having it removed from them. Afghanistan, Pakistan, some of them would rather have the money spent on different health conditions than trying to eradicate polio. And that's quite hard. When it's going to cost an awful lot to get rid of it, how do you measure the future benefit? How much money did we save by not having smallpox? We don't know. You can't calculate it. So was it worth that large expense at the very end to get rid of the very last few cases, identify, find them? I don't know. It gets very hard when you have a world where money becomes so much more important. Could you do a cohort study? One country with drugs and one without. That wouldn't work. That would be also unethical. So you could compare two cohort studies, but countries are very, very different. If you take what's happening in Georgia and you compare it to what's happening in Russia, the cultures of both countries are quite different. The approach to drug use is quite different. So it becomes very difficult to do those comparisons between countries. You learn things, but there's not much help if you learn. What we really need is a different government that approaches things in a different way, because that becomes very difficult to implement as a group of activists. And also, there is oodles of social research that says this would all be a lot better if the government just did it better. It doesn't get you very far. Originally, again, up until yesterday, I had an well, we could observe Iceland and Georgia and see how they work, and then we could pull out the learning from them. But they're not really studies, they're proofs of concepts, apparently, from Gilead said. So they're just to demonstrate that it is theoretically possible to eradicate hepatitis C as a public health problem. So that's not necessarily actually getting rid of it from those countries. So if to answer social questions often, you can't use medical research, you can't use scientific methods, what do you do? First of all, there are a number of different types of social science, and I've put up a few there, and I've included law, because that's the one I work in, although some people argue it's not particularly social. But all those different ones often use different types of methods, so the way they approach and the way they do research. So psychology on there, some of it is very desperately scientific, and some psychologists are desperate to prove they are scientists and not social scientists. And some succeed and some fail, and there are problems in psychology because of that. Is there anyone here who studied sociology? Oh, heck. All right, I'm going to rubbish that in a minute. But well, only the beginning. But we'll come on to that. But I'm first going to look at what is the scientific method. And in English, it's often written as a singular thing, as though there is one way that pure science is done. And it's not really true. So if you take two pieces of information you want to find out, if you want to find out what temperature water boils at, there's a way you do that. And if you want to find about what wildebeest look for in one another for sex, there's a slightly different way you do it. If you want to find out what temperature water boils at, and you will find that it boils at different temperatures in different places, well, you go to those places, you take your water and you boil it and you measure the temperature. You change some variables and you control all the others. So if you go to the top of Mount Everest, water boils at 72 degrees centigrade, and in Mexico City it's only 92 degrees. So it's quite hard to get a decent hot cup of tea at the top of Everest. Oh, well, that's Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay.
Brits.
Sorry?
Brits, of course.
No, neither of them was British. No, Edmund Hillary was a New Zealander. Yeah.
Well, from nearby.
Oh, yes, from nearby, yes, yeah. And I think actually Tenzing Norgay got there first, but they didn't say that until after Hillary had died. If you want to see how wildebeest mate, what attracts them to one another, you can't take wildebeest to different places. You can't collect wildebeest and put them together. It's too difficult and it's too dangerous. So you just go and watch them. You just observe. And this is much more like social science. You observe what goes on and you try and work out what's important. And if you observe male wildebeest behaviour, you will discover that we believe the way they try and get a mate is they use pheromones. That's smells to attract. Females is the idea. They also use their dung, it's their shit, they're rolling it and they wipe it around places because that produces a nice smell. And whether that smell is to attract women or is to ward off other males, we're not quite sure. And they defend territory, they fight one another. The observation of females is they just tend to pick the one who's got the best piece of territory. Has it got the best food? We don't actually know if they're really interested in the smell, or their size, or their horns, or they were good at fighting, or just they've got the best place to live. So that's where we're going. And the women tend to live in a large herd with the younger males and the young, and they just move in. Yeah. Right. This is where I get to say nasty things about sociology. The father of sociology is a French gentleman, Émile Durkheim, and he decided that he would take previous pure scientific methods and he would use them to understand the way society worked. And to a large extent, he's very important in sociology because he sort of set up the boundaries of what sociology is. So I'm now going to make fun of him. What he was looking for was social facts. Let's start with facts, and if we just start with facts, then we can't go wrong. It will all be logical, it will make sense. And he talked about the social fact of suicide. Suicide was nice, clear. Someone was dead, you knew they were dead, it was marked down as a suicide in records, therefore you've got that collection of numbers. And he wanted to find out the causes. Why did people commit suicide? So he started with a definition, which was where someone died, directly or indirectly, either actively doing something or doing nothing, and doing that thing knowing that it will end up with death. So that could be jumping off a building, or that could be choosing not to eat, or if you were ill, choosing not to have medicine and letting yourself die. Now, he was actually doing his study in the 1880s, 1890s, so you might have done better to avoid medicine entirely. People discussed with him whether this was a good definition of suicide, because this would include, if you wanted to protect someone else and you jumped in front of a horse and cart, you would have been considered under his definition as having committed suicide, even if you were doing it to protect someone. He excluded people who were fighting in wars as well, because he just decided that didn't count. And having got this data, he then looked at the numbers and he compared it across countries. He looked at the rates of suicide in men and in women. He looked at the impact of when there were big changes in economy, so when you had a boom in a country and people got richer, and you had a recession and people got poorer. And he looked at their religion, because he was working in France and he was working pretty much in the data that he got around West Europe. And he found economic change increased suicide. In a recession, more people kill themselves, according to the data. He also found more people kill themselves in a boom. So logically, he said, it is not about whether you get richer or poorer, it is just a change. People struggle to cope with getting more money or getting less. He then looked at being married and being single, and he said that men who are married are much less likely to commit suicide than men who are single. It doesn't work for women though. Just as many women who were married committed suicide as who were single. And he also found that there was a higher rate of suicide in Protestants, apart from in England. And so his reason why people commit suicide, just check that on the next slide, is thinking about things. If you are inquisitive and you reflect and you think about things, you are more likely to commit suicide than if you don't. And that a good strong religion, like Judaism or Catholicism, stops you thinking about things. So, as I say, it was in Western Europe, so there was nobody orthodox. He didn't look at any rates at those churches, and he didn't look at Islam either. He also realised that women commit suicide less often because their brains aren't big enough to do thinking. He was a man of his time, 1890s. We don't accept pretty much any of his theories now. And these were the facts he ended up just starting from numbers. And this is really one of the reasons why you can't do it that way. You can't logically work out answers. He also could just have asked people, why do they do something? And it would be useful with wildebeest if we could just ask them, what is it you liked about that one? Or what didn't you like? We could ask the 5% of female wildebeest, why is it you were attracted to that particular female wildebeest as opposed to that female wildebeest? About 5% of wildebeest, female wildebeest cows are gay, lesbian, whatever the right word is. And that's standard across most mammals. Seems to be certainly amongst females 5%. We don't really have figures for males, but that's particularly because some of them just shag anything. Sorry, am I too loud?
No, too fast.
Oh, too fast. Wave the thing. Although that might seem obvious, if you want to find out why people do something, ask them. You would be amazed that people will do research and fail to do this, that it doesn't occur to people in doing a piece of research to ask the people the question they're researching about. This was a study done in England, and it measured where people lived and where they went to hospital. And I've put those two pictures up because the one in the blue thing is the town I live in, Brighton, and Guy's Hospital, where when this came out I was going for quite a lot of operations on my ankles. And having completed this study, they could not answer the question. If they had actually asked people, when you go for your care, do you have to go to another hospital or do you just want to, they might have got an answer. There are a number of social scientific methods, and you will know all of them. They're all, well, not quite all of them, but most of them you will know. Observation, interviews, surveys, statistics. Ethnography is where you go and do something. Ethnography used to be a great thing in anthropology, and it was mainly white Western people went to South Sea Islands and lived for 6 months in interesting places with the natives, and would then come back and write it up, and they would inevitably spend the whole time writing about their own society, and you learned almost nothing about the society they'd spent 6 months in. Margaret Mead is a classic example of this. She went to, I think it was Tahiti, and came back and really wrote about the sexual issues that happen in the US rather than in Tahiti, which is where she lived for 6 months, because it was there she noticed all the differences and how hung up and strange and screwed up they were in the US. Because these are different ways of doing research, you have different approaches. There is a whole subject of methodology. You don't really get methodology in a lot of pure science, because they generally make it as easy as possible so they don't have to talk about it. The randomized controlled trial is designed so that a hamster can work out which one is more effective than the other. It's very, very simple. It is much harder when you are doing observing things or when you're being ethnographic to know what is important and to know what is not important. So, when you do a survey, and the HAND project is a survey, you want to do a survey with the same questions, asking everybody, so that then you can compare the answers. There's not much point asking one person one question and a different person a different question, because you can't then compare the answers. So you have to decide what questions. And you also have to decide what topics you're going to ask questions about. So you need some kind of method to come up with the topics.
I want to find out if focus groups count as part of the social science research method.
Oh yeah. Pretty much anything that involves talking or writing will be social science. Ooh. I did that one. So a lot of you came up with very different things. There were some things that were repeated a lot, comfortable, central location, and there were many things that weren't. Cute reception stuff, was it? This is what they had on TripAdvisor. However, if we were to do a survey to work out which would be the best hotel for us to go to in Brussels, would that method that I've just used to get you to pick out something different, something relevant to this hotel, do you think that was the best way? Were there 3 really obvious things that came out of all the things you mentioned that we could use to work out what would be the best hotel to stay in next time? Warm. Oh, sorry?
We need to compare the food.
We need to stay at more hotels in Brussels. I'm not sure about that. Was there anything really important from the things we came up with that was actually missing in terms of comparing those hotels?
Price?
Yes, the price. Because
So we don't pay.
yes, because we don't pay. But that is probably the most important issue in making the decision about the hotel. If it is beyond a certain price, it's just not going to be available for us. So there is also always an issue in social science research. Have you missed the most important thing because it's obvious? One of my statements, I like hotels with roofs in. That's really important, but it's generally not written as one of the important things in hotels, because you expect every hotel to have a roof. And I hope you never have to stay in one which doesn't. So what I was trying to get across was, first of all, I didn't ask you the right question. If I'd asked you 3 things we could use to compare hotels, you would probably have come up with much more similar things, and you would definitely have come up with price, because I'm sure that's what you use when you do a social survey about where you're going to stay in somewhere. How much does it cost? It's generally the first thing you do. So you have to ask the right question to find the information. And I know that is, how much more obvious can you get? Ask the question and ask the right question. But it is surprisingly difficult to get the question precise enough and clear enough so that you get the answer you want. So, to come to something like HAND, in order to get the answer you want, you have to ask the right question. So if you want to do lobbying, you need to ask a question where the answer will give you the answer that is helpful for lobbying. Yes, Maxime?
When you we put the question, ask the question, but I mean the relevant question or the important question. I can question that by saying important or relevant to whom? To the person who conducts the survey or to the person that is answering the survey?
Yes, yeah.
Which, if I may expand, that's one of the biggest problems I have within the EATG about answering surveys, and I've decided not to answer surveys anymore because I don't understand the purpose. You know, that can be discussed tomorrow.
I have taken the purpose of hand as being to lobby, but that is purely my perspective. That is my guess when I've read the survey questionnaire. So in order to do something to lobby, you need to write questions in a way that you get the answers, and you can use the answers to come up with the sort of conclusion you want so that you can lobby. So with hand, it's very much there's particular countries picked, so if we can get answers from these 7 countries, we can use it then hopefully as a lobbying technique to say that there are problems around hepatitis access in prisons in some countries and not others, and there are some solutions. However, one of the other issues you have is putting answers together. So when I went round and you highlighted all those different things, some of you talked about the hotel being conveniently located and some as centrally located. Now, if I was to put answers together, I can say very broadly, well, location is important, but those could be 2 different things. That could be you wanted to be in the centre of Brussels, or it could be that it was located convenient to the airport, the train station, wherever it is you came from. So sometimes that means that those can work together, and sometimes they can be separate. Now, the idea of coding is that you bring things together that are the same, so you've got answers. Now, with numbers and with some things, you can do that. So if you ask someone when their birthday is, it doesn't matter how many different ways they say it, it's all the same date. There's 4 different ways in English of writing out a date. I did actually have 20th of May there, but I couldn't abbreviate May into anything shorter. So I changed it to October, because that's my birthday. You have the same with numbers. If you ask someone how much of something and they say a half, 0,5. In English you say 0.5. I should have written it in English. 50%, a half. You can write, but you know those sorts of things are really easy to code because they are exactly the same, and you know they are. And you would like language to be like that. But if you have a question like this, and you ask the same question to people, and they come up with these answers, they are all similar, but they're not quite the same. So it depends what you are coding for. What is the important thing you are looking for? If you are looking for just being single, then all of those people were single. But if you were looking at something like bereavement, there's one in there that's bereaved, and then there's one that's the person has left them, so there's a sense of bereavement as well. So when you code, in effect, through a collection of words, it's also the important thing you decide as the researcher that you want to look at. So the person doing that work does a number of decision-making things that are often unspoken and unsaid. They read and think, oh, that's important, and that's what they talk about, and then they see someone else said something similar, and they will group it together. And you can end up with a sort of bias around that, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that later. There is also just problems with words. We have just heard from Janssen, we have just heard from Gilead, and there's another issue with words. This is the EATG's Facebook site. I had to go and look at this.
Catherine Ashton was before.
Sorry?
Catherine Ashton was before.
Catherine Ashton, yes, that's it, thank you.
I don't know how many of you use Facebook. But if you looked at Facebook to try and get an understanding of reality, it wouldn't be very good, because people generally use Facebook to make positive comments. A lot of the rubbish in people's lives, a lot of the boredom, doesn't go on Facebook. An awful lot of the cats go on Facebook, and babies. I don't know why people need to put up pictures of their children to prove their children breathe, but that seems to be an important thing. And yeah, cats falling over. So, social media and the web is a place where people do a lot of social research because it's already written down, it's already available. It's much easier to collect words if they've been typed than it is to interview someone and type what they've said. So we will get generally more skewed view of the world if we start to use things like Facebook to see what's going on. You very rarely get people on Facebook saying they're depressed. It happens every so often, and people often get a bit of support. But if they do it a second, third, fourth, fifth time, they get less and less support each time. So people learn quite quickly that's not the place to say, I'm having an awful day. Because people get bored of reading those things. What I was trying to get across is there isn't a not that everything has that form, even language as we use it. The fact that we're speaking in English, which is, as I've said, is easy for me, imposes a more difficult thing on pretty much all of the rest of you. So reality isn't reflected in the words we use perfectly. It's not that specific. It's more vague. And that whenever you study it then, you've just got to accept it's going to be vague. It's not going to be a perfect reflection. So when you do a piece of social research, you've got to acknowledge that's there. You can't get rid of it. You just have to know that.
That's what sociology is.
The other thing I also want to put up, this is the EATG website, and this I presume is the photo of yesterday. What we put up on the Facebook page doesn't represent what happens at the meetings, because it can't. And the way EATG puts things on its Facebook page, I'm sure, is mediated, that it's done in a certain way because it has an agenda, it has a task, it has a function, it's wanting to present a certain image. And that's what Facebook's for. It's not a bad thing, but that's what it's for. But if you then wanted to do research on the way community organisations are, if you look at Facebook, you've got to know that everyone's presenting an image on Facebook, rather than thinking that is some true way of measuring what they do. And there is the problem that the way some people see the world is different to the way other people see the world, as Maxine pointed out. This was, let me see, I think that was a month into him being president. He accused the media of describing what was happening in his government as being chaotic, but he didn't see it that way. It is a fine-tuned machine, and I've been so disappointed journalists have not asked him if it is still a fine-tuned machine, his government. So if you're going to do a piece of research, and I'm going to come on to hand in a bit, and I'm going to get you to do some, how do you find sources if you're going to do social science? In medicine you go to PubMed. That is the place you get publications in medical journals. There isn't anywhere in social science. There isn't an equivalent. There are some databases, but they're not very good, and they're very limited in terms of their language. So a good search engine is what you need. And a good search engine is different in different countries. So using Google in Russia is not going to get you stuff that another one like Rambler might. What they access is different. The second thing is, in a lot of times, there isn't a document. There are reports of it. Sources from the government say, we get that quite a lot in Britain. If a member of the government wants to leak something, if they want the public to know it, but not say that they're the person telling it, they leak it, and then it says sources close to, which just means them usually. And that therefore sometimes what you get are not the original document, but you get a report about it, a secondary source. And that's what you have to find. That's the thing you refer to. And that comes with problems. That is a journalist's interpretation. That is them trying to remember what was said. Or that is the thing that was said that is what they were told was said. That is what they want that reporter to write about. And then some of you did find whatever the actual document was, if there was one. The next thing I wanted to point out, and I'm really chuffed about this, that I think Maxime was the only person who didn't take the opportunity to say something in his own language. And of all the people, of course it was you. What I'm trying to get to, I was trying to highlight. No, the next thing I want to put is actually one of Maxime's points. In EATG, we use English such a lot that people will assume what they have to find is an English document. That what you were looking for, and what some of you went to issue of, where is the English translation of that? Or how do I find the translation? When we're doing some of this research, we will want the original document in the original language, not the English translation. An official English translation is great, but you have to have the original document in the original language as well. And one of the things that I suspect people will do, because it's come through EATG, communication is almost always in English. People will think, well, I better find an English thing to send back. And also, the English language search engines, as I've mentioned, don't work very well for other parts of Europe. I would actually say Google.com is rubbish for the UK. It's fine for the US. It's okay for Canada, but it's very poor actually on the UK. And there is a separate google.co.uk site that makes it slightly better. The other thing that I want to mention, and you brought it up fantastically, even a document like that, it's just a letter that is so boring, and they all say pretty much the same. Isn't it great that you got elected, and we love the democracy of the US, where you've got 3 million votes less than the other person and you won. There is a context to it. So the way Greece sends information is reminding the US, and you've got bases here, and you need us. Remember us, don't forget us. Georgia, we're your big ally over here. Angela Merkel can be a little more careful, and she can say things in a way that doesn't say things because she's confident and strong enough as Germany, but other countries don't do that. The Philippines will have sent the most nauseatingly you're wonderful, the greatest person in the world stuff, because that's what the Philippines always does. It's obsessed with the US. And some South American countries will have sent that, and some will have sent nothing. That there is always a context with documents, and sometimes that context is important, so that not only sometimes you need the document, but you need the context that goes with it. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there for 15 minutes for a break. Now back to social research. Bias. I mentioned earlier I was going to say something about bias, and also this somewhat relates to context as well. And also the idea that the researcher is often in charge and makes decisions that are important. So if you're looking for sources and you want to find something, not only is it never going to be nice and perfect, but it's going to be biased, and it will be biased in various degrees. And there's simple things you can do just to look at that. And this works for medical trials just as much as social trials. Who funded it? Remarkably, when a drug company funds a drug trial, it usually finds a success in its drug because they're funding it, so they're going to structure it that way. And you can do the same in social research. Marketing is all about getting the right answer. Who published it? And the reason I put on there, is it a press release? And we'll see that with drug companies who like to have press releases rather than publish research or presentations at conferences. But universities do this a lot now as well. Particularly, I noticed British and American universities, when they've done a piece of research, they'll put out a press release to say how wonderful their university is, and they will make a stupid claim often about how much it is going to change the world or has changed the world or how new it is. Yet, when you look at the actual research, it's often much weaker. Press releases have become a way of getting your name known as a university. So if you are looking at sources and finding things, if it's a press release and it's about a piece of research, bear in mind it's going to be biased because they're putting in the best, most newsworthy thing they can think of. They will be sexing it up to try and get it in the papers. And of course, who wrote it? Some people, when they write things, bring a bias to it. They write about it in a certain way, and everything they write about always reinforces that view. Does it list where they got their information from? And I'm just going to go through a couple of these. I don't know if you know Kim Jong-il. It's very difficult at this. I have to try and think of people who will have a cultural resonance across the whole of Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Central Asia. So I've tried to come up with world figures. Kim Jong-il, our dear leader, has now died. He wrote a varying number of between 530 and 850 different works. Some of them were books, some of them were operas. I believe he also played football and won the World Cup for North Korea, and he cured cancer. Some of those may have been British newspaper reports that were making fun of him, but I don't know. However, you can buy his selected works. There are 17 volumes of them, 12 of which are translated into English. They don't sell very well. He is, though, a bit of a biased author. He does tend to see the world in a particular way, and the way he writes about it might not be the way the rest of us understand and see the world. And also, he does look like he is a villain in a James Bond film, which probably doesn't help. You can get repeated photos of him in this position as well, with the glasses, without the glasses, sunglasses. I don't know what that obviously has some meaning in Korea. However, you get this with what is trying to be objective research. And this is a piece of research I came across a few years ago. It's all about HIV care. And it was a study to see in the US who was best at providing HIV care. And they had a number of measures. Did people do things? Did they take the right sorts of bloods? Did they ask the patient about adherence? There was a variety of things that people were measured on. And they spoke to nurse practitioners, they spoke to specialist HIV doctors, they spoke to infectious disease doctors, and general doctors, general practitioners, local doctors often. And then they rated them. And the nurses seemed to come out at the top, and then you can see the ones in bold, the darker numbers. This was care that on their markers was significantly worse. So you can see who the best one at doing this is, and you can see the ones who on some of the markers are significantly worse. And then when they wrote it up, they said that the nurse practitioners were similar to physicians in infectious diseases and general medicines for 6 of the 8, and superior to that of the expert physicians, the other 2 quality measures. Nurse practitioners perform statistically significantly better than the general ones on 6. And that is a very accurate reflection on that. The nurses, they're better than everybody on these 2, and they're better than the general one on those 6. And you can see that quite clearly. So that's quite honest. So why have I shown this? Because when they get to the conclusion, they say that nurse practitioners and physician assistants are close to HIV experts, suggesting that it was the HIV experts who were the best at providing this care, and nurses were fairly close, and the more junior doctors were also close, but that the general doctors were really bad. And that's because it's a doctor's website this appeared on. So a doctor writing about doctors was not going to say, well, actually nurses were better than doctors at doing this. So they write on there, nurses were about the same as doctors, when actually nurses were obviously better. But they bring their bias because they're a doctor, and they're writing on a website for doctors who don't want to read that they're rubbish at this. Who don't want to read that they are worse than nurses. So you get that type of bias in all sciences, and you also get an audience bias. This is a crowd in North Korea, and they have a bias because they will be expecting certain things to be said in certain ways. If you went to this crowd and you told them that Kim Jong-un was not a good person, they would not believe you. There is nothing that you could say that would change their mind because they bring with it a pre-existing bias. They already see the world in a particular way. Now, they may not actually think that he was a god, but they're going to struggle with the idea that he wasn't one of the best people there's been. And this is the Flat Earth Society. Do any of you know of the Flat Earth Society? They believe the Earth is flat.
HIV is not the cause of AIDS.
Oh, they haven't got that conspiracy on their website. They're very specific to the flat Earth. They haven't branched out into others yet. Give them time. Sorry?
We use that in the trainings.
I've been gazumped. It's the Quebec one. Don't use the Belgian one. They're a joke. They only get it up there as a joke, the Belgian society. But this is the Quebec version. This is their perception of the world. And it does seem they really believe this, that they are not making a joke. But because of this, the way they interpret the world, it is always to fit in with their view. There is no possible evidence you can give to this group to demonstrate to them that the world is round. If you took them in a plane and flew them round, they would say that you've just flown round in a circle above the flat Earth, rather than going round the globe. If you took them onto the moon, they would say it was just a visual image, because they have made this decision. This is an article of faith. And the way they justify it uses what appears to be logical argument, which is if the world was a ball, the water would just fall off at the bottom. That there would be no atmosphere, that it would collapse, and it would look like the moon. And that's why the moon has no atmosphere or ocean, it's because it's fallen off. So, what I want to get to, when you do research and when you do social research, you need to have sources and evidence. And you will bring biases to it, but that's okay, as long as they are not stupid biases, like my flat Earth example. And the sources are the justification, they are the evidence. So when we did the thing about what did your head of state say, you all knew your head of state had somehow, some way passed on congratulations, because heads of state always do. But to prove that that really happened, you then went and looked at it. And I'm guessing for some of you, it was discovered, well, it wasn't a document. If I thought it was a document, it was just a phone call, or it was a press release, or they haven't even released it. Why are they hiding a letter that said, congratulations? For a number of the bits of research that EATG are going to do, they're going to ask people for things, and you're going to need to provide the sources of information rather than just going, I know that. And it's actually really frustrating when you do research, because you think, well, I know that. I know the epidemiology in prisons in Britain, this percentage of people have Hep C, because I've read it continuously. And then you go and look for the document, and it's really annoying and can be a struggle to find it. But it's actually very important. You can't just write, that's what it is. They also allow someone reading the research to see that you are being truthful. You're not hiding things, you're not making it up, you're not just saying it's like that. And this particularly gets me because I teach in a university. When I mark something, I may think, oh, that's an interesting finding, and I go and read it. So I go and look for that research. And I did it recently with a PhD that I read for a friend, because it was on an area I knew a bit about, and there was an interesting finding, and I turned to the back, and it wasn't referenced. And then I looked at the next thing, and they hadn't referenced that, and hadn't referenced that. Now, that person failed their PhD because they put in information and there was no way of seeing if it was true or not. Now, they were sloppy. They weren't lying, but they had to go back and rewrite it because they had a whole chapter with no references in effect. But they are really useful because that's how you move on from research often. If someone claims something, you can go and see whether it's true or not. Who says something matters. When a person makes a statement, you are more or less likely to believe it depending on the person. How many of you believe E equals MC squared?
Sorry?
E equals MC squared. Have any of you ever doubted that E equals MC squared? The energy is equal to mass times the speed of light squared multiplied by itself. It's Einstein's most famous equation. He never actually wrote it until he put it in Science Illustrated, which is a popular magazine, and he put it as the title. That was never in his maths work. It's a simplification of what the equation he wrote. But we pretty much accept it's true partly because who said it, and he was clever. Donald Trump made this statement on April the 24th. No administration has accomplished more in the first 90 days. I actually think it's a really clever statement, but do you instantly believe him because Donald Trump says he's done more than every other president ever has? Or are you cautious? Well, the reason I think it's a really clever statement, it is impossible to measure that. What does he mean by more? One of his criticisms of Barack Obama was that Barack Obama spent too much time playing golf. So that's him having a meeting with Abe, who's the president of Japan, which they had on the golf course. Prime Minister. Oh, thank you. Oh gosh, yes, they're going to gone. They need a revolution. However, he very definitely does tell the truth sometimes. I just wanted to go through a number of justifications. And some of these are bad and some of these are good, and some of them depend on the context. The first one, this is true because I say so, is not a good way of justifying something. You can make an argument on this. This is true because I believe... Sorry?
In certain ways, when you are doing some kind of social research, it is actually a way to process things. Just to ask people, how do you feel about that?
Yes, and then they can be truthful because you're asking, in effect you're saying, what are you going to say? And they say it, so it must be true because they've said it. But as an assertion of a point or to make an argument just because I say so is what parents say to children, and that's when it's at its most effective. Because I believe it is actually a really common justification now, and it's really quite hard to deal with. We have a huge problem with it in the UK. There are a number of people, and they say they're right because they believe it. They don't care what the evidence is. They believe it, therefore it must be true. And it particularly works with prejudices. After the ones lower down get stronger and stronger, what we want to get to when you have a piece of research is that it is true because you have good evidence for it. It is very hard to get to the point of because you can prove it. Proof is a very high requirement, and you often can't get it in social research, but you can have good evidence for it. So, identifying sources, and in a minute I'm going to say a bit about the HAND project, but these are the places where we want people to go to do research to find out details. And the research is generally about people's own countries or the country they live in. And some of it is going to be in medical journals, so you might be able to do something like PubMed. But a lot of it is not. It's going to be in other sorts of documents, and it's appreciating the context in which they're written, what they're saying, how close they are in what they say it is to the reality. So a government document may be a very clear description of what happens in prisons. It may be a complete lie. It may be a policy that never gets enacted. There may be rules about what should happen, but they never do happen. And when you're doing that bit of research, you need to have both. Quite a lot of information is probably going to come from organisational documents. Those are just some organisations in HIV and hepatitis that I can think of, the medical ones, some of those. Social science journals actually are not the place to find things. They don't publish much useful information in social science journals because they're much more theoretically based, or they're quite specific about a very small topic area. They are not a great source of useful information for the kinds of things that EATG does. And also, it may come from interviews. That would be you as people doing an interview to find out something and recording it as an interview. So, I want you to have a go at some short interviewing techniques. And there are two issues that I want to particularly look at in terms of interviewing. And one is about talking, and one is about listening. And so I'm going to do a couple of short exercises, and this would be really useful if you do this in a language group. So if there are two of you with the same mother tongue, this does not have to be in English. Any language will do. You can do the first one in two different languages if you really want, but the next one, it's necessary for people to understand each other. So I want you to just spend 2 minutes with one other person, and I want you to talk at them. I want both of you to speak for the entire 2 minutes. So you don't have to listen to them, but you just have to keep talking. Alright, as we've drifted into search engines, I'm going to move on and skip this, but there would be a value in you being comfortable in doing interviews with people, because quite often, particularly in some of the smaller countries, both East and Western Europe, the only way you find that information is by talking to the people who work in that organisation. And that one of the future things that EATG is wanting to be doing is for people to be able to go and do interviews and ask people things and have that interview recorded, and then it come back to EATG for it to be transcribed and analysed. In general, I've mentioned very much at the beginning that you couldn't really get to things like validity and reliability in social research. So you have persuadability. What you are trying to do is persuade people the argument you are making is correct, that what you are saying is true, and therefore they should believe it and act on it and do something. Now, that is not as good, that is not as strong as saying this is definitely the case. This drug definitely cures people of hepatitis C. What you are saying is this seems to reduce stigma in society, whatever it is. And you are trying to argue for it to happen. So you can't necessarily demonstrate this works. What you can say is this makes a difference and push people to do it. And that's because the world is complicated. There are a whole variety of things that affect what we do, the way we act, the way other people act. Societies are different. They aren't all the same. And in doing research, much as you want to try and do things in the same way, sometimes you have to compromise and do them differently. In some cases, you do a survey and a question just cannot be translated properly into that language because the concepts aren't there to do it. You can get that quite often with issues around sex. So you end up not doing it, or you ask a different question, and it's just a compromise. You also have trying to do things in the same way across groups, and sometimes you have special circumstances. If you were to knock on the door, even in Belgium, even today, of Pride, and ask, we're doing a survey to find out how many people have HIV in this country. If you just walk door to door, you would end up with a much lower figure than if you organised your survey in a different way where it was confidential, and that's obvious. However, if you wanted to find out how many people were married or single, you would get a much more accurate answer going around knocking on doors, because people will answer that. They will say that honestly. There is not an issue with that. Where you are dealing with an issue which something is stigmatised, People will not tell the truth. People will act differently because of that. So sometimes you have to vary things. And things change over time. In the UK, where I live, I now live in what for me seems a very strange time, because gay marriage became legal about 5 years ago, which means that it is no longer homophobic to ask people if they're married, which to me, who's someone who grew up in that was the way things were, that was a very obvious question, are you heterosexual, or I'm assuming you're heterosexual, it doesn't mean that anymore. And even I, some straight man who's still hanging around the HIV sector, find that odd, that a phrase that was formerly a form of very gentle prejudice that was used has stopped being that, particularly amongst young gay people. Marriage is just the thing that they want to do, quite a lot of them. They still get divorced as frequently as heterosexual people. But so things change over time. So surveys done about marriage and the way people feel about marriage in the 1980s and 1990s have no meaning in Britain now, because it's changed so much. Now, this is what the HAND project is. And it's, looking at access to hepatitis and hepatitis treatment in a number of countries. It is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There was one other country. Moldova, yeah. It is only in those 6 countries plus Moldova. I was not involved in picking those countries, and I cannot give you a reason why. Also, the individuals who are doing the research for each of those countries have been identified. And if I got this right, they get paid, don't they?
Very little, but yes, there is a...
You didn't have to say very little. I was going to try and entice people later on. You could earn a bit of money. It's a day's pay, because it seems to be it'll last about a day. But there's quite a number of questions in the survey. And what the desire is to identify the issues and needs of people who are co-infected in prisons or the penitentiary system, and come up with solutions. And there will be a report, and that will be partly descriptive of the current situation in all those countries, and then coming up with policy recommendations from that. So it's going to need a whole load of sources that are then analysed and referenced. Those sources are then available, and then Svilla is going to produce this report from those documents. And these are the types of information that are going to be collected. Now, some of those may be easy to find. Epidemiology is the kind of thing that may have been collected. They may not bother at all in those countries, but if they're going to collect something, there will probably be the epidemiology. Another thing obviously going to look at is prevention. Are there prevention things in prisons? Now, this is a much more difficult thing to find, because first of all, if there are no prevention programs in a prison, no one is going to write a document that says officially we don't have any prevention in our prisons, because people don't write, certainly government departments don't write things about it in that way necessarily. They just say nothing. So it's very hard to find a reference often or a source that says this country does not do opioid substitution in prison because nobody's written anything about it. Or they don't do it anywhere, so they definitely wouldn't do it in prison. So in those sorts of circumstances, you may end up having to interview someone who works in a prison who can say, there isn't any, it doesn't happen. That's the only way you can get a source and a piece of information for that. Things like numbers of tests and a diagnosis algorithm in prisons. A lot of places are not going to have that. It's not going to be written out. So the only way you're going to find that out is by asking someone who works in a prison, what happens if someone's got Hep C? Do you provide treatment or not? And how is that decided? Then things like regulatory documents. Those sorts of things may actually appear in government websites. They may be difficult to find, but they may well appear. However, they're almost certainly going to be in the language of the host country rather than translated into something else, particularly for Moldova. They might translate that into Russian, but I doubt they'd bother translating their regulatory policies into English, because it wouldn't make a lot of sense. So it's necessary to have often a native speaker to do that research, or someone who speaks that language. And therefore, that's why EATG wants to be able to employ people who speak that language in that country to identify those sorts of documents, and then they can be referenced. And then EATG can produce a report and back up its findings with evidence. Coding and NVivo. I mentioned a bit about coding. NVivo is a piece of software that you can use that looks at words. I'm not a big fan of it myself. I've used it once and I thought it was interesting, but I didn't feel it helped me code much quicker than doing it on paper. There were some things it did well, and some things it did, which I'm not really sure how it related to research, but you could do them and move them around. NVivo, it's a piece of software.
Yeah, to do what?
Content analysis.
Okay.
Yeah, content, to look at words and to bring them together. To do coding, I don't want to. It'll take me 10 minutes to explain what it does. It's boring. At the moment, the first part of this project, it is happening, and the research is being done, and the individuals who are looking at those countries have already, I hope, been collecting that research, and there is expected to be a first draft at the end of this month. One country was behind, and I've forgotten which one it was. France, yes, France is behind. Okay, so this is one of the first questions on the hand survey. These are the last two slides I've got, so get through this and you can all go to the bar or have coffee to wake you up. So I'm wondering, can you do this? Can you find out, for the country you live in, this data? Okay, please do, and please email it. Okay, I'm going to stop now and hand over to Sergey, because I've run out of things.